Hey, thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Roots Podcast. Today I want to talk about life on the frontier and the beginnings of Vaquero culture in Mexico. So, the typical translation of the word Vaquero into English is cowboy. And we all have an image of what the cowboy looks like, right? It's something that you've seen in Hollywood movies. It's, the gunslinger. He's a vigilante fighting for justice, or he's a bandit, or he's a sheriff. All these popular images, exist out there to express the idea of being a cowboy. Pretty much all of those are wrong. Those ideas were popularized by Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, with the spaghetti Western films and, the John Wayne films. Those ideas or those perceptions of the word cowboy were created more or less through Hollywood. But there's a much more deeper meaning to the word cowboy and its Spanish translation, vaquero. The other popular image that we have of the Wild West is the Native American on horseback, the Plains Native. You might think of an Apache or a Comanche, out there in the plains fighting against westward expansion. And, so that's another image that's conjured up. Again, that is not a vaquero. So then what is a vaquero? What makes somebody a vaquero? In the strictest sense, a vaquero is a cattle rancher. So then you might be thinking, well, then how does that apply to Mexico? How did this, cattle ranching culture arrive in what is now Mexico? And how did Mexicans become vaqueros? So the cattle ranching culture or the vaquero culture in Mexico dates back to a man named Gregorio de Villalobos. And he arrived in Mexico in the 1520s, and he was the first person to get permission to bring cattle into Mexico. He obtained that permission from Hernán Cortés, who at the time was governor of Nueva España. And so the introduction of cattle ranching into Mexico began with those two people. And so you can say that they were the first two vaqueros in Mexico. Now remember, this culture came from Spain, so they weren't the first two vaqueros ever. They were just the first ones to bring it to Mexico. Now this culture, this vaquero culture that was brought from Spain, that's different than charro culture. And I'll get to charro culture in a second. Similar, but it's different. So now let's talk about where in Spain this vaquero culture came from. So the image of the vaquero in Mexico, it's very popular, right? Especially in northern Mexico, but to some degree all over the country. Now in Spain, the type of vaquero culture that we have is from southern Spain. If you look at a map of southern Spain, there's a river that cuts through the region. It's called the Guadalquivir River. And that river cuts through four important provinces where this culture developed. Córdoba, Sevilla, Huelva, and Cádiz. So those four provinces is where this vaquero culture emerged. Even our guy, Gregorio de Villalobos, he was from the province of Huelva and he had family in the province of Sevilla. So he was very much tied to the region. Now, also in that area and also part of the vaquero culture that we have in Mexico, there's a special horse riding style that's important for the practice. It's called doma vaquera. And this type of horse riding style is important because, it focuses on knowing how to, manage the horse using one hand, because you would have to use the other hand to be able to lasso, cattle, or to be able to round them up using a lance. And so this practice developed in that region. Even the horse breeds that were used from, this early vaquero period, the horse breeds were from southern Spain, from the Andalusia region. And, even that has a much older history. There's a lot of influence from the Moors, like the North African culture that helped to develop those breeds. So we've covered the origin of cattle ranching culture dating back to Gregorio de Villalobos, and we covered where it's from in Spain. It's southern Spain in those four provinces that we talked about. And then also we talked about the horses. The horses are also from Andalusia. So now what about the iconic cowboy hat? Now remember, it's not the hat, it's not the boots, it's not the clothing that makes you a vaquero. Being a vaquero means that you're a cattle rancher. But the iconic cowboy hat also originates in Spain. And I'm not talking about the charro hat, the one with the super wide brim. I'm talking about the iconic vaquero hat, or, the cowboy hat. And so that iconic vaquero hat or cowboy hat originated in the province of Cordoba, which is in, it's one of those four provinces that I mentioned. You have to remember that the vast majority of Spaniards that ever went to Mexico or to other parts of Latin America, they came from southern Spain. So the way they dressed, greatly influenced the type of Hispanic culture that made its way to Mexico and to, the other parts of Latin America. So this vaquero culture, characterized by the type of, cattle ranching they did, the horse riding style, the type of clothing they had, all of that, all packaged up, came from southern Spain. And so this vaquero hat from Cordova developed, sometime in the mid 1600s. Now, vaquero culture had already made its way to Mexico. So the vaquero came first. And then later, this hat emerged in the culture, and that also made its way to Mexico. So we have Gregorio de Villalobos, the first one to bring vaquero culture into what is now Mexico. Now, who brought vaquero culture further up north into what is now the American Southwest? That was a separate expedition. The first Spanish expedition to bring cattle through the American Southwest was that of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. Now, that expedition, the Coronado expedition, began in 1540, but what's interesting about that expedition was that it didn't come directly from Spain. The people who joined that expedition were already living in what is now Nayarit, Mexico, and also, the Jalisco area. They came from Nueva Galicia. When Coronado was planning that expedition, to move northward, he was governor of Nueva Galicia, which was the area around Jalisco, Aguascalientes, Nayarit, Zacatecas, etc. And so they traveled northward, and they brought that cattle with them. And, those cows marched alongside those soldiers all the way up north, to places like New Mexico. But the Coronado expedition didn't build any permanent settlements. They all went back to central Mexico. Permanent settlements in the Southwest, the American Southwest, didn't happen, for a few decades to come. So then who built the first permanent cattle ranching settlements in what is now the American Southwest? That was done by Juan de Oñate. So the conquistador Juan de Oñate led an expedition northward from central Mexico, and he established the kingdom of Nuevo Mexico in what is now the American state of New Mexico. Now remember, this is 1598. This is a time where there were no English settlers anywhere in the Americas. So the very first cowboys or vaqueros, whether it be in the Caribbean or Mexico or the American Southwest, were Hispanic people. Now, another interesting fact about Juan de Oñate, he wasn't actually born in Europe. He was of Spanish origin. His parents were Spaniards, but he was born in what is now Zacatecas, Mexico. So he was among the first criollos ever to be born in colonial Mexico, and he's the one who brought cattle ranching culture permanently to the American Southwest. So if the vaquero was just a cattle rancher, where did this rugged image, this fighter image come from? Because, a cattle rancher isn't necessarily a soldier, right? Well, the vaquero was very much a fighter, especially on these northern frontiers. The vaquero was very much a fighter, especially on the frontier. You see, for the first 250 years of Spanish colonization, Spain did not have a permanent military anywhere in the Americas, not up until, around the 1760s. So who protected these towns? The towns were protected by local citizens. Local citizens would form militias for their towns. And so whenever there was a Native American incursion from, let's say the Apaches or the Comanches, the townspeople would get together, gather their weapons and go fight. And they did this too if there were British incursions. There were British pirates that would raid villages along the coast. And so these citizens would fight the British, they would fight Native Americans, etc. And so these vaquero men, they were very much part of these militias. They were the horsemen, and a horseman was very important on the battlefield. There was a very popular militia in northern Mexico and what is now the American Southwest, when all this was still Nueva España. This militia was called the Soldados de Guerra. Now, this militia of horsemen, they protected the region, but their full-time jobs, what they did when they weren't serving, military functions, they were cattle ranchers. And it was precisely because they came from these very prominent families, these very wealthy families in the cattle ranching industry, and the fact that they could, ride a horse, they were very skilled at that, that they were able to, be part of these very prestigious, military roles in Nueva España. One particular characteristic of that militia was that the militiamen, they wore these jackets made of leather. It was very lightweight, but it was able to protect them from arrows that were being shot at them, by Native Americans in the area. Now, this is what was the key difference between the Vaquero in Spain and the Vaquero in northern Mexico. The Vaquero in Spain was just a Vaquero. In many cases, they didn't serve this type of military function because southern Spain was at peace. They had kicked out the Moors in 1492. So, going forward, the land was pacified. But that was very different than northern Mexico. Northern Mexico was constantly at war. The war with Native Americans in northern Mexico, that continued on long after independence, up until, the late 1800s. So all of these towns in northern Mexico, they were on a permanent war footing with nomadic tribes, the Comanches, the Apaches, and other groups. And so the Vaquero was very much, a rugged man on the frontier. So if you were a Vaquero, not only were you tied to these very wealthy families, remember, if you were a cattle ranching family in your village, if you weren't the richest family, you were one of the richest families in the village. And but also these men were skilled at riding a horse, and you would have to rely on them to defend the village when there were incursions from Native Americans, and also from Anglo settlers that were starting to make incursions out west. Maybe I'll do a separate video on the Battle of San Pascual in that's a battle that took place in California. The Mexican side actually won that battle, but it was during the Mexican-American War. And on the Mexican side, the soldiers, they were all lancers. So these were men who were vaqueros, who were trained at, cattle ranching, and they had lances, the same kind of lances that you would use for cattle ranching. And they went to war against American soldiers, and they actually won that battle. That was in Escondido, California. But I'll do a separate video on that. Now, when I talk about these Spanish cattle ranchers and these Spanish militiamen, let's not forget, these men and their descendants stayed in Mexico. So if you're Mexican and you have Spanish ancestry, especially if you're from northern Mexico, these are your ancestors. We're not talking about people that came here, did some cattle ranching, and went back to Spain. We're talking very much about our ancestors, right? And that's why we're doing genealogy, to learn more about them and the life they had, in those times. I'll talk a little bit about the charro now before we close this discussion. The charro was a rancher, okay? So not just a cattle rancher, okay? A vaquero was very specifically a cattle rancher. Charro is more of a generic term for rancher. So you could be a chicken rancher, you could be a pig rancher, or you could be a cattle rancher. A charro cuts across all those industries. Now, charro culture originates in Salamanca, Spain. Salamanca is much further up north. It's not part of the Andalusia area. So the culture has a different origin. So charro culture, the style of dress, the dancing, the lifestyle, that arrived in Mexico in the 1700s. And those families settled in the area now known as Jalisco. And so that's why when we think of charro culture, it's very much associated with Jalisco even today. Now, charro culture and charro clothing took on a life of its own once it got to Mexico. So the charro outfit that we see, something that when we have an image of Zapata or, images of what a mariachi would wear, that is very different now than what the charro looks like in Salamanca, Spain. They have the same origin, but Mexico's evolved much differently. The charro outfit as we know it today began to take shape around the 1880s. Now, believe it or not, Porfirio Diaz actually had some input in this. So under Benito Juarez before him, The Mexican federal government created a federal police force. These people are known as the federales. It was during the administration of Porfirio Diaz that the Mexican government made the charro outfit the uniform of Mexico's national police force. And so it was during that time they created a very iconic and recognizable look for the charro. And culturally speaking, this created a much more standardized popular image of the charro throughout the country. And interestingly, even during the revolution, the outfits worn by Emiliano Zapata and many other revolutionaries, they also had the charro look. And then, decades later, Mexican cinema also helped to popularize the charro. So it had a little bit of a different origin, a different evolution in Mexico than, Vaquero culture. So I think I'm going to go ahead and close the discussion right there. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you all again next week.